Well, so let's go to the the next slide if we can. Yeah. So hello everyone. Again, thank you for being here, and just really want to reiterate the things that you heard Amy talk about in terms of the voice and expertise of parents. In the ECHO model, we really do recognize that it's an all teach, all learn environment, and I'm going to be doing a lot of talking for the next 50 minutes. But my hope is that, at least through the chat, for those of you who are interested and willing to comment in the chat, you'll be able to participate in this conversation. And we have a lot of people who are on deck ready to respond and engage and expand the conversation in the chat. It's really hard, though, for us to create an environment where 300 people can all have something to say. So we're trying to use a multimodal approach to our communication. So today's conversation is really about irritability and challenging behavior. And I'm going to start by talking about what really irritability is. Next slide. So irritability, it's a jargony term. It's a term that doctors use to describe a mood. And what kind of mood? We've all probably at some point in time were able to describe ourselves as irritable. But when we're talking about it among children with autism, what are we referring to? Next slide. If I gave you a chance to tell me what you think irritability is or means, you would probably come up with some words. I'm going to take a guess based upon years of asking parents this question. When you describe your child as irritable, or when you think of yourself as irritable, or when other people describe your child as irritable, what other kinds of words could people use? Next slide. Clinically, we are typically referring to the kinds of behavior patterns. I'm going to use that word multiple times today. Behavior patterns where we see kids who aren't cooperating with us. Again, clinically, some clinicians, some psychologists, developmental behavioral pediatricians, psychiatrists will call this non-compliance. But really what we're referring to is when we ask kids to do something, or we need them to do something, they're not ready to do it, or they're not willing to do it. They can do it, but they're not willing to do it at that moment in time. The other thing that we often throw into this category of a mood, of an irritable mood, are tantrums, where kids are really dysregulated with their behavior, with their voice, with their movement. The other thing that lumps into this is self-injurious behavior, where kids are doing things to themselves that hurts themselves, scratching themselves, biting themselves, banging their head against walls or floor or other objects. We also lump aggression into this category, where kids may be acting out toward other people, kicking, pushing, fighting, spitting. And then we also lump in property destruction. When kids are very upset and angry, they may end up destroying things in their environment, swiping things off a table, breaking glass, punching walls, breaking sometimes even their favorite things. They're so frustrated. Next slide. So, yeah, so on this slide, what I want you to just appreciate is another way of thinking about these terms so they don't sound so clinically loaded. Non-compliance. My child doesn't do what I ask. That happens to us all every day. There are situations that we all get in where we may be asked to do something and we don't want to do it at that point in time. Tantrums. These are going to be the kinds of things where kids might cry or scream or stomp. Self-injurious behavior, again, is when they're hurting themselves with either, by bringing some kind of injury upon their body. And aggression is hitting, scratching, biting, kicking, and property destruction very much just means break things. Next slide. It's another way to think about this is that it's a quality or state of being irritable, a certain kind of mood. It's a shorthand way of describing all those things that we just talked about. Sometimes people are talking about the fact that kids are set off fast, like they're like a ticking time bomb, and one little trigger sparks and blows them up in terms of their overall irritable mood. And another way of talking about that is that kids are particularly sensitive or easily triggered. Another way that psychologists sometimes refer to irritability is a tendency to be easily annoyed or to be made angry quickly. Next slide. And I'm going to ask Laura to just keep clicking through this slide because you're going to see lots of other words that parents have used, teachers have used to describe kids. I use these words to describe when I wake up on the wrong side of the bed some days. I have a sense of self-awareness when I might be more irritable on any given day. This is part of the human condition. We all aren't happy all the time. Pause there, Laura, for a second. In the end, it creates a pattern of behavior that can be problematic for us. In the end, as you just saw, it's a warning sign. A warning sign that something more serious might be coming. Next slide. So when we have a pattern of behavior, when we have these warning signs, we have a few choices. And sometimes those choices are not mutually exclusive. Depending upon how we feel that day, what resources we have, both emotionally and the setting that we're in, we have choices to make. And at the very least, we have to live with the behavior, right? We just have to tolerate it, get by, somehow survive the day. Next slide. More than just living with it, if we can figure out a way to cope with it, all of our interactions are just that. It takes two people, right? And when a child is irritable, angry, when they're showing tantrums, a pattern of aggression, difficulty cooperating with everyday tasks, that's going to elicit a reaction from us. And usually our reaction to irritable behavior is to become also irritable. And when one person in an interaction is getting irritable and the other person's getting irritable, guess what happens to the first person? They get more irritable. And what happens to the second person? They get even more irritable. And it just becomes this escalating cycle of irritability, and no one is stopping it. Well, when you're someone who is the parent, the older, wiser, live longer individual, you have an opportunity to try to break that cycle. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is first starting with coping, recognizing that you can break this cycle. And if you can't, if you're not in the right mood or the right space, sometimes just pushing away and taking a break and just living with it is okay, right? Just getting by. But if you can cope and you can regulate your own emotions and you can conjure up a way of responding that can do something different, put the child on a different course, try to change the child's trajectory for their day, then that's where the next step comes in. Next slide. Where we want to think about managing the behavior. Now, managing means that we're just going to try to contain it, right? Or we're going to try to prevent it. A lot of what I want to talk about today is how do we prevent problem behaviors from ever happening. When a kid is irritable, when they're showing this pattern of self-injurious or destructive or aggressive or tantrumy or non-compliant behavior, how do we just sort of manage it? How do we get by? How do we prevent it? But here's the next step. Next slide. There are going to be times where we can, and we have the energy and we have the skills and we have the opportunity to change the behavior. And there are two ways that we think about changing the behavior. One way is to reduce the negative behavior that we're seeing, the maladaptive behavior, as we'll come to call it. Another strategy that we try to use is to think about how do we teach other behaviors that prevent, that replace the negative behaviors. Again, you probably all can resonate with the idea that if you wake up on the wrong side of the bed and you stub your toe and you grump about it, an alternative might be to sort of say, "Oh gosh," I do that sometimes because I don't want anyone in my family to hear me swearing and saying a curse word. So I learned to say, "Oh gosh," or when I'm at a sporting event and my team is losing and the referees have called a bad call. I want to say something really horrible, but there's little kids around me. So I say instead, sugar beans, right? I have a replacement behavior for my irritable behavior. And what we will often try to emphasize at the highest level of our response as agents of change in a child's life is to focus on what we can do to change the behavior, to change and reinforce and develop new behaviors so that a child can do something different than respond irritably and respond in a more adaptive or productive way. Next slide. So when you put this all together, sometimes we're just managing behaviors. If you have to, you just live with it, you get by. Managing means that you're doing a little bit more than getting by. You're thinking about how do you prevent it or how do you reduce it. But you're always going to have to find a way to cope. And if you're coping well, then you will be able to bring forward these skills of managing or changing. Next slide. But we're moving real fast here. Sorry.
Is this the correct slide, Eric?
You know what? I think I actually can share now. So I think that's going to be easier if I can share.
Oh, I see.
So it's just happened. So this might, because I think I'll be a little bit more fluent. It is the right slide. You're right. All right. Now, are you seeing my display or?
We're good.
You're good. Perfect. All right. This will be better. Thank you, Laura, for pitching in there while I couldn't share. All right. So let me pick up here. In order to cope, manage, change a child's behavior, we have to really start changing the way we think about these behavior patterns. And the first thing that I'd like to do is recognize that we have been taught and we have recognized in our own lives good and bad behaviors. Are you having, what kind of day are you having? How are you today? Oh, I'm good. Oh, today's a bad day, right? We use these terms all the time. They're not helpful to us. They're not going to help us think about our child's behaviors in a way that allows us to change them, that allows us to cope with them effectively, that allows us to just manage them. So instead, I will encourage you to think about behavior with two other words. Is the behavior working for the child in some way? Or is the behavior not working for the child in some way? Is it causing limits to their life? Or is it opening up doors in their life? The behaviors that limit a child we call maladaptive. They are behaviors that take away opportunities, that limit their relationships, that prevent them from being able to interact with other people in their lives. And then adapting behaviors that we consider adaptive, are those behaviors that push kids toward a more full, joyful, engaging life and set of experiences in their lives. So in the end, this comes down to us thinking about two sets of behaviors that we want to change or manage. The maladaptive behaviors we really want to manage and or reduce. And the more maladaptive behaviors we want to increase, we want to promote. So irritability is that thing that we want to reduce or change. And the idea that kids can learn to manage their emotions in a more productive way reflects this idea of promoting emotional regulation. Now, before I get too far into this, I want to highlight that there is a distinction between more mild and then moderate and severe challenging behaviors. The most severe challenging behaviors, you're probably not going to be able to manage just with the recommendations that I'm offering today. Instead, we're going to probably need a whole host of other interventions and a lot more support. But one of the things that I hope that you walk away from today's Family Echo is recognizing that there is an opportunity for you to try to manage these behaviors differently than you are. Right now, you're just living with them. But if you have skills you can bring to the table, you can learn to manage and potentially change them over time. So that being said, the most severe problem behaviors, these things could help you with, but they won't be all that you need. And what is our goal? Our goal is to stop mild adaptive behaviors from worsening into more severe ones. So in this way, that what we're talking about today could be really helpful. And one of the things that we really emphasize is the best intervention for a problem behavior is the intervention that prevents a problem behavior from happening. So prevention is the best intervention. Dr. Geib and I were talking earlier today about a patient of hers where she instantly said to me, I really should work to prevent these problem behaviors in this child. My point there is we all continue to learn this idea in every scenario. When something happens that didn't go well, when more maladaptive behaviors emerge than were helpful, we can reflect back on how we could have prevented them. By the end of today's session, you'll have a sense of some skills that you can use. Some people get stuck on what causes irritability: the tantrums, the aggression, the self-interest behaviors, the property destruction. And it could be lots of things. You know, stressors in your everyday life, a homework assignment for a kid, depression, anxiety, fears, worries, phobias, having a bad night of sleep, being hungry, having low blood sugar, having a hormonal imbalance, even more serious medical concerns, severe constipation, for instance, or pain like a severe earache. Lots of things can cause irritability. It's important to reflect on those things because those things might have other interventions than the behavioral strategies that we're talking about today. But in the end, one way that I like you to think about what causes irritability, those things are things to explore, but you can get stuck on those things, and those are things that necessarily you may not be able to change. In the immediate moment, what usually is causing an irritable reaction from a kid is frustration. They can't get what they want. Or there is something they specifically want, they see it, or they can label it and they want it, and they're being specifically restricted from having it. You know, if you told me that there's ice cream in the refrigerator, I always want ice cream, right? And so I'm going to want to go after it. But if you stand in front of it and aren't going to let me get the ice cream, I'm going to get mad. And believe me, that happens. I love my ice cream. The other thing that happens is that kids can just be lonely. They can be wanting attention from somebody. They could be bored and they could be looking for stimulation. So one way to think about this is anytime a negative behavior is happening, we're always confronting ourselves with this question: why is this behavior happening? And everything that's on this slide behind the red box could be the answer to those questions. The trouble is, none of those answers drive us toward an immediate strategy that helps us change the behavior or cope with the behavior or manage the behavior. So what I want to do right now is introduce you to a way of thinking. And you might have done this before, but I'm hoping that it becomes a skill in your mind now. The way we typically think about behaviors is we try to break them down into 3 components. This 3-term model has 3 interlocking components that are contingent upon each other. They influence each other. They interact with each other. We call it the ABC model of behavior, where there's antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. The funny thing about all behaviors is that they always have an antecedent. Something always happens right before a behavior happens. And then there's some behavior that is problematic for us, that maybe is maladaptive for the child. It's not really opening up their world, it's shrinking their world in some way. That behavior is going to be best described in ways that can be counted and timed. If I said I was happy, you don't know if I was giggly. You don't know if I was smiling. You don't know if I was laughing. I could have had 3 different behaviors to describe how I was happy: giggling, smiling, laughing. But look, giggling, smiling, laughing can be counted. How many times did you laugh? How long did you laugh? Right? So if you are describing a behavior in ways that can be counted and timed, then you're now describing it in a way that we could potentially modify or change it. And that behavior, my giggle, my laugh, my smile, had some antecedent. Someone told a dad joke and I laughed, right? It had an antecedent. It also has a consequence. If someone tells me a joke and I laugh, chances are that person's going to smile back at me. And we've just had this social interaction. And that reinforces me too, right? I feel good that they feel good that I laughed at their joke. Every single behavior that a kid gives us, including all the maladaptive ones, follow this 3-term model. Follow this model of antecedent, behavior, consequence. And of course, sometimes there could be more than one antecedent, but there's always something that happens right before the behavior, immediately before it. And then there's always something that happens immediately after. But there also can be more remote consequences too than what happens immediately after. But what we recognize in most maladaptive behaviors is that the trigger, or the thing that happens right before the behavior, and the consequence that happens right after it, that's most important for us to know. So we're going to go into a practice session right now. And what we're going to see here, this little boy, we'll call him Max, is the name I usually give this young kid. And we're going to see the child and parent interacting. And what we're looking for here is what might be going wrong in this scenario. What is the parent really struggling with? What is likely causing this child to have this misbehavior? We can assume that this is probably a pattern of behavior for him, that this is something that this parent sees a lot. So let's take a look at it. I think Laura's going to hit play for me.
Dr. Buddha, you'll have to hit play since you're sharing the screen.
Okay.
Did you share your sound?
Yep.
Oh, now we know. All right, it's lunchtime. But why? Because it's lunchtime. It's not time for brownies. I said it's not time for brownies. Right, you can have one brownie. That's it now.
So think about this scenario a little bit, and I might play it one more time. But here we have little Max coming in, asking his mom, who's doing something. She's sitting there at the table. She's reading a book. He interrupts her and says, "I want a brownie." And she responds, "No, you can have a brownie." And then he does something. And you might call that a tantrum, but I would encourage you instead to say he stomped his foot more than once. He raised his voice. He repeated more than once asking for the brownie. So there are these behaviors that he's done. And I'm describing those behaviors not as a tantrum. I'm not calling him a brat. I'm not saying he's difficult or he's mad. I'm saying he stomped his foot. He's put the brownie back down on the table, the box. He raised his voice. I'm really describing the specific things that he did. But then more critically, I'm going to say, well, what was the consequence of that behavior? What happened right after it? And in this case, mom gave the brownie to Max. So if I asked you, why does Max behave this way? Why does Max have tantrums? If tantrums are defined by stomping feet, raising his voice, throwing the brownie box on the table, why does he do this? And you can let me know.
To get what he wants.
Yes, exactly, to get what he wants. Or in this case, to get the brownie. So mom,
I'll highlight just a couple of comments in the chat. It looks like a few folks have identified exactly that mom is sort of giving into what he wants and maybe indirectly directly encouraging the behaviors that he's just demonstrated in order to make that request.
Right. And so the next question I would ask, and this is probably an easy one to answer. Do you think Max is more likely to have more tantrums or less tantrums, more or less? And it might be good to see a few comments in the chat from folks based upon this interaction. Lisa, you can let me know what you're seeing.
They are all saying more, Eric.
They're all
Definitely
saying,
more.
Definitely more. Yeah, right. And so what this demonstrates in a very simple way, what this case is showing us is that all behavior is learned. It doesn't mean that this mom woke up that morning and said, "I'm going to try to teach Max how to have tantrums." That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we all behave in such a way to get what we need or want in this world. And there probably are other ways that Max could learn to request a brownie. But in this scenario, he asked a certain way, he was told no, and it resulted in a tantrum. Now, you can imagine how this tantrum could be worse, and they often are. You can imagine how these tantrums could lead to more destructive behavior, and they often do. But let's take a second and think a little bit about antecedents, the things that happen right before a behavior. In this case, if you spent a few seconds thinking about what happened right before the behavior, what kinds of things happened. In this case, the mom said, no, you can't have the brownie. What if she said something different? What if she said, you know what, you can have a brownie, but let's have lunch first? Different way of responding. It might have elicited a different reaction from Max. We don't know, but maybe it's worth a try. Let's think about antecedents, not just consequences. What happened right before? You should be thinking about the fact that he must have seen that brownie somewhere. Was it on the counter, or was it in a cabinet or a drawer that he could access? What was mom doing? She was reading a book. Do we know what time of day it is? Is it close to lunchtime? Is it close to dinner time? My point is, there are a whole bunch of antecedents for us to consider. And our interventions might be different. The way that we want to cope, manage, change this behavior might be different based upon what antecedent we're paying attention to. If we think he's hungry, it's close to a mealtime, the intervention I just mentioned might be the right intervention. No, you can't have a brownie right now, but you can have one if you're still hungry after we have lunch. What if he's actually not interested in the brownie at all? What if he's actually interested in getting mom's attention? She's reading a book, right? She's distracted. Has a big, thick book. Maybe she's a student. Our intervention is going to be different based upon the antecedent. In that scenario, if it's really him, he's bored and he wants mom's attention, we're probably going to have to set up a scenario where he has something to do, or that he has some other strategy for getting mom's engagement to play with him. So this is a very simple interaction. They happen hundreds of times a day between parents and their kids. And in that one simple interaction, we have just spent 5 minutes thinking about this case. And we have come up with more than one intervention, more than 2, more than 3 possible interventions that we could potentially use. Let me go on and just underscore this idea that when we are looking at that 3-term contingency, at the antecedent, behavior, and consequences, we are looking for patterns of behavior. And I was trying to emphasize not just consequences in that scenario, but also the antecedents, because what I know I want to talk about next is the idea that prevention is intervention. When we are able to identify and then eliminate triggers to a behavior, so minimize the impact of antecedents to an adaptive or maladaptive behavior, that really does allow us to make our days go much more smoothly. And we have a number of prevention strategies that we typically like to recommend. One way to start thinking about this is to think about when kids are little, how do we prevent them from falling downstairs? You can chat in a response. Everyone probably knows what you do. We put up those little baby gates, right? And we also want to make sure that kids don't drink the cleaning products under the kitchen sink. What do? We put those little locks on the cabinet. We change something about the environment to prevent our toddlers from getting into trouble. Well, there's a whole list of prevention strategies, and you can see control the environment is one of them. Change, control, something about the environment. But there are a whole host of other prevention strategies that we often recommend that people do. I'm going to walk you through each of these briefly. The first is sometimes you just avoid certain situations. You avoid people. If you know your child has a hard time waiting in lines, now there may become a time where we need to teach him or her how to wait in lines better. But if those lines are currently causing you significant tantrums, you might just learn to avoid them. In fact, most families land on avoiding situations or people as a pretty simple prevention strategy, just out of living with the behaviors like I talked about earlier. But it's okay. It's okay that this is the Band-Aid for now. Or there are some situations that maybe a kid just never is going to have to go to, right? The other thing is that sometimes kids will do things for one parent versus the other. Why bang our head against the wall? Why run into a brick wall over and over again? Let's just have dad do that or mom do that, whoever he does it best for. And we can worry and change later how he might do that for the other parent. Or maybe if a kid is going to spend overnight with grandma, but he always gives a tantrum when grandma tries to help brush his teeth, maybe he doesn't have to brush his teeth that night, right? There are things that you could stop doing or expecting just because it's a certain situation or a certain person that a child is having a difficult time with. I mentioned controlling the environment, like putting locks on the cabinet. What about at school? Sometimes kids are sat in a certain place in the classroom, or sometimes they're sat around a partition so they're not as easily distracted by other kids in the class. Again, these are not things that we might want to use long-term or always, but they might get us through in a pinch. One of my favorite prevention strategies is helping kids do things in a small enough dose that they can cooperate with, that they could tolerate. Or helping them do one step of something rather than doing all the thing. And we can get cooperation and they can feel success. If I told you that you could win $1,000 by running a race and no rules apply, what would you do? If the race was a mile long, what would you do? Would you start at the starting line? I didn't tell you you had to. If you told me that I could win $1,000 for running a race and everybody else was more athletic than me, I would start 1 inch away from the finish line, right? And so that's the idea here, is that we help kids do all the steps that they need before we ask them to do the last step. And then the last step we might ask them to do independently. That's a way for us to try to reward them for doing one small step. If you have a whole pile of Legos to clean up because your child's been playing hard all day, if you ask the child to clean up the Legos, they may not be willing to do it. But if you ask them to clean up the Legos after you put all of them in a box except one, it's an easier task to do. If your child has trouble in a grocery store, maybe you go in and just grab milk with them and check out rather than shopping for 10 or 20 or 30 things. Don't do your big shopping. Instead, focus on doing some practice runs where you get one thing and get in and get out. If you're going to a family gathering, a holiday party of some sort, and your child has a hard time at those events, maybe they can stay for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And again, the idea is that this isn't going to be forever, but for now, you do things in small doses or small steps and your child can have some success. Another prevention strategy is just changing the order of events. A child can become aggressive when they have to turn off their iPad, for instance. And maybe you have to turn off your iPad because, gee, you can't go to school in your underwear. We have to put some pants on. Well, maybe the thing to do is to get dressed for school and then you get access to your iPad, right? Do the thing you don't want to do first, and you do it because you get access to the thing you do want to do. Parents will tell me all the time, I know something bad's going to happen. I see the look in his eye. When she says that word, there's going to be a tough moment right ahead. That gives us an opportunity. If you know your child that well, if you know when they're about to have a difficult moment, you can respond to early signs that that problem behavior might be coming. What this does, it really does recognize that you're the expert of your child. You with them every day. And you know that they're probably going to need some help to get through this tough moment. They don't know it, but you know it, right? And in this way, you can provide extra assistance to them. You can redirect them to a different pattern of behavior since you know that the difficult problem is coming. In the case of Max earlier, I actually used this intervention in my description. Our 6th prevention strategy is change how you ask or respond. Instead of using the word no, I suggested that maybe Max's mom could provide a choice. In this case, it was, let's have lunch first, and then we can see if you're still hungry for a brownie. Or you can have an apple or a glass of juice right now, but the brownie will have to wait until after lunch, right? So there are other ways to respond other than just no. And the second to last prevention strategy that I'm going to offer you is this idea of setting events. And this was some of those first things on the list of irritable causes, right? Times where you might be irritable just because there are other things setting you up to have a bad day. You might be hungry, you might be sick. You might have missed your medications for one reason or another. And if those are the things that are setting you up to have a bad day, that's really good to know. Parents, older siblings, other relatives, teachers should know those things that are setting up a kid to potentially be more irritable on any given day. And then what we do is we might adjust our expectations, right? Just like you probably do for yourself. Hopefully you do self-care like that. You know you're having a bad day for some reason, or a tough afternoon for some reason. It's okay for you to adjust the expectations for yourself in your day job and your parenting. And we also want to do that for our kids. The last strategy that we call a prevention strategy is really this idea of using visual or auditory cues. We might use pictures, and we're going to say a little bit more about pictures here in a second, to help structure a child's approach to their day or moments in their day. We might use lists and to-do lists. We might use timers to indicate the length of time that a child is engaged in a particular activity. This implies that scheduling is a strategy that we might be able to use to really expand how we're thinking about prevention strategies. Look, we all benefit from structured routines. The more structure and routine we have to our day, the better things are going to go that day. So when things are predictable for us, it offers us an opportunity to use other prevention strategies. So one of the things that I often ask families to do, and you can do this with your parenting partner, you can do this certainly with your child, if your child can participate in a conversation and helping write down their daily schedule. But I sort of ask families to just write out what your schedule is in a typical day, from the time your child wakes up to the time they go to sleep. And then in the course of that, identifying, either you and your child identify the times and activities that could be challenging, and really describe the kinds of problems that might occur during each of those activities. And then put that aside and come back to this idea after you rethink through what is a perfect day. If everything were to go right, what would the day look like? And if your child can't participate in this activity with you, try to take your child's perspective on a perfect day from behind their eyes. How would they experience the day? And it's really important in this to be thinking about those activities that occur during the day that are going to be fun and joyful for your child, or what psychologists call reinforcing. Once we have the schedules in place, once we know what a good day is like and what we know what a typical day is like, it allows us an opportunity to come up with some different scheduling strategies. And one of those is to really be thoughtful about how do we rearrange the schedule. When we know the trouble spots, we can consider rearranging things so that tough things happen before more fun or more enjoyable things. It also allows us to think about where do we add prevention approaches into our schedules. One of those is just changing the time of the demand. Sometimes, getting a bath in the morning is a pain in the butt for a kid, but it might be more fun to get a bath at night, or maybe it's the reverse for your child. The idea here is that when you have something on the schedule that isn't working, is there a different time of day where you could put it so that it might work better? I've implied this intervention multiple times before now, but now I'm going to give it some words. Do your best to use fun activities to reward the completion of less desired activities. And then the most that you can do to establish a routine in different parts of your day, the better, where it's very predictable. Why? Because when you develop a schedule of any sort, and I'm going to be talking in a second about a visual schedule, it's really important to make sure that that schedule is clear and understandable to your child. And when we do that, we will be able to build a routine. And if any changes come up, it'll be clearer for your child that those changes are there, right? Changes happen every day. We can't have a predictable routine every day. But when changes do come up, it'll be obvious to your child. Your child will appreciate it. They won't have to necessarily understand in words if you're using a visual schedule, to help them appreciate that there is a change. And I really like that we use a muscle here, because the more that we have routines and the more that we have a visual schedule that supports those routines, then the greater the likelihood are that we're building up muscles to help us be resilient. Routine ends up being a muscle that allows us to be resilient to those times where there's changes, those times where we need to be flexible, where we need to bend with the change, right? So the more routine that we have, the more likely we are to be able to cope with changes when they come. These are examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Using a visual schedule like these picture icons. Most of you, if you've been in the world of autism for more than a few months, you probably have been confronted with visual schedules. Lots of ways that you could use visual schedules, lots of different resources online that can help you learn how to use visual schedules. But I would venture to tell you that we all use visual schedules. We all use a calendar. We all use to-do list. This is not specific to autism. We all use visual schedules in our life in some way. The thing that about a visual schedule, though, when you're trying to use it to help you manage and change behavior, is to recognize that it should be put in a central place. We should encourage our child to use it. We should review it with our child that it's available. We should really encourage the child to participate in using the schedule. If they can talk about it, great. If they can't talk about it, having enough time to pause and look at the picture is a good replacement for talking about it. It's really important to make sure that your child's engaging with the visual schedule, not just it's being put in front of them. One of the ways that we do that is by using visual schedules that can actually be manipulated physically, where you're taking a picture off a Velcro board. And the idea is then the schedule has to be complete. You have to go and finish the activity. You have to return to the visual schedule to see what's next. And you have to have some place to put the discarded thing, the thing that you just did and completed. Like when I cross something off my to-do list, you got to put it away. It's done. There's some satisfaction in throwing that thing in a box, that little part of the visual schedule, and then you move on and do the next thing. So we're back to Max. Let's take a look at him using a visual schedule.
Hey, you're all done brushing your teeth. Put it in the bag. Very good. Now what do we have to do? Put on coat. Okay? Let's go. Take it. All right, let's go put on your coat. Come on, let's go. Good. You put on your coat. Put that in the bag. All right, what's next? Put on backpack. Okay? Let's go. Come on, let's go put it on.
So what's neat here is that you see exactly how we use the visual schedule. And you see that he completed the activity, brought it back, and he had his coat on, and then he was ready for the next thing in the cycle. I won't ask you any questions about that. It really was an opportunity for you to see Max actually using the visual schedule in his everyday life. Before we end, though, I want to talk a little bit about how do we respond to maladaptive behaviors. And you've heard this before probably, but a lot of parents will tell me, I've tried ignoring my child's irritable behaviors, but it doesn't go away. It just gets worse. And that's probably true. And in fact, we know that when we ignore behaviors, they do get worse. That being said, planned ignoring is probably the most effective intervention we can use for particularly behaviors that are designed to get a parent's attention. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. But there are a couple other things to mention. We will also talk about how do we build patterns of compliance. We'll talk about using some teaching strategies to regulate emotions. And I want to mention some things briefly about intervention planning around crises. So let's take a look at planned ignoring in action.
Peanut butter and jelly, come on.
Again, we think about what this mom could do differently.
Having chicken nuggets. Chicken nuggets. Chicken nuggets. You've had chicken nuggets today.
Ask yourself, what is she doing wrong right now?
Let me hear it for you. How did it feel? Okay. Right.
So again, you know, for time's sake, we're running out of time, so I want to be thoughtful about this. And so I won't necessarily ask you to respond here. But in this case, what you see mom doing for Max is she is responding to his every request. And all she's doing is training a very strong resistance. And eventually she gives in. She says, I'm going to give you chicken nuggets and you don't have to eat this sandwich, right? And all he's learned in this scenario is that he's just got to persist. He's got to persist. He's got to persist. And eventually he will get what he wants. So we're training strong resistance here in him. So the way to really use planned ignoring would be to do something very different in this scenario. And that would be to avoid any eye contact with him, even when he's asking persistently, chicken nugget, chicken nugget, chicken nugget. The idea for mom would be that she would just be looking away from him. You wouldn't be touching the child in any way. You would use a neutral facial expression. You wouldn't talk to the child at all. And your ignoring would be obvious, abrupt, and really exaggerated. And a lot of people would say that this is hard to do. A lot of people would say that it's hard to do in part because it feels uncaring. But the reality of it is what you're trying to do is you're trying to encourage your child to do something that's going to be healthy for them. In this case, eat a healthier sandwich and chicken nuggets, right? Or whatever the situation is. If they're giving you another misbehavior, another maladaptive behavior, by ignoring the behavior, you're helping them recognize that they're not going to get your attention with the negative behavior, but they can get your attention with a more positive behavior. There are some potential problems with this, and I really want to make sure that I underscore them. Behaviors will always get worse before they get better. Expect that. Ignored behaviors are going to escalate. Some behaviors as a consequence can't be ignored. Where a child is running away from you and toward danger, that can't be ignored. You can't ignore behaviors where a child is being overly destructive or aggressive, right? So there are going to be times where this just doesn't work that well. Children will learn to be persistent. So it's really important that if you're going to give in early. It will take a while to work. And not all behaviors, again, can be completely ignored. And so we have some modifications that we often recommend. You can ignore the child and their behavior. That's the classic way to ignore, the way I've just described. But what if your child is doing something that's repetitive and annoying? Where you could ignore that behavior, but maybe not the child. This is the classic, are we there yet? Are we there yet? When are we going to get there? Are we there yet? Are we there? Coming from the back seat of the car, right? And I might respond to a child who's doing that, not with, we're going to be there in 10 minutes, settle down, or we're going to be there in 2 hours, settle down. Like, I'm not going to respond to that. What I will respond to is, wow, look at that cow over there, right? I respond in such a way that nothing is going to be talked about that the child's talking about, but I try to get them distracted and thinking about something else. So I'm ignoring the behavior. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? But not the child. There are other times where I can ignore the child, but not the behavior. And this is where we're getting into more of those dangerous things, where a child might be hurting himself, hurting other people, destroying property, where I will not talk to the child. I won't use eye contact, but I may prevent them from running away, right? The thing you don't want to do is when you're preventing a child from running away is talk to them. Because at that point, you're also adding an attention level of a consequence. And so if a child wants to get your attention, they may just run away from you. There's one last intervention I think I'll highlight today before we wrap up. And it's this idea of compliance and cooperation, because we opened with that, right? We talked about how one source of irritability is when we ask children to do something they don't want to do. The funny thing about non-compliance is it's a habit. And if it's a habit, it's a bad habit because it's closing a child's world. And so we can probably teach and reinforce a more productive habit of some sort. So how do we do that? Our goal is to build this new habit of compliance, listening and following through on what we request children to do. The thing to keep in mind, you know, as we all know, habits take time to practice. You know, my doctor tells me that you know, eating a healthy diet will take you at least 3 months to really establish, right? So we know that building new habits takes time, and it takes structure, and it takes some discipline. One of the things that we have found is recommending this strategy. We usually ask parents to generate 2 lists, a list of things that a child will almost always do, they're cooperative with all the time, and a list of things that a child can do, but won't typically do, right? So those are the things in life that they experience as chores or hassles. And then what we try to do is we encourage practice. Really practice the list that the child will do all the time. Practice that often. Why? Because what's happening is if you give an instruction, here, eat this piece of candy, or here, turn on your iPad. If you are giving an instruction, the child's following through, and then you're saying, good job, fantastic, thanks for listening to me, you're building a pattern of compliance with that child. And then what you try to work in, as you're working that list of things the child will do always, you try to work in this idea from the second list B, of things that the child won't do. And you try to add one of those commands in. And you keep that at about a 1-to-3 ratio. And if you can do that, you're going to find that the child is able to cooperate with you more fully. So it takes some steps and it takes some practice. But particularly when you're working that non-compliance list, we encourage this 4-step process. Don't try to give a command far away from the child. Instead, be close to them. Get their attention. Make sure they're looking at you or you're looking in their eyes and you're close. Tell them what to do. And at the same exact time you're telling them what to do, say it very clearly. Pick up the Lego and put it in the bucket, right? It's very clear. And at the same time you're doing that, give them some kind of help to do it. Gesture, point, maybe, move their elbow a little bit. Do something to help them cooperate. And then as soon as they're cooperating, and this is like really quick, right? As soon as they're cooperating, you praise them. You say, good job. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for putting the Lego in the bucket. And I have a video of Max doing this.
No, no throwing. Please pick the pepperoni up off the floor. Good. Good listening.
So you see here, mom doing exactly what I suggested that you do. She stands close to the child, make sure she has his attention. She probably could have done a better job of even getting eye contact with him. She tells him what to do, and at the same time, she's physically helping him to do it. She's not providing more help than she needs to provide. She's providing just enough help that he cooperates. And as he did it, she praised him. I'm going to stop sharing there so we can wrap up today. I didn't quite get to everything I wanted to get to, but I got through some of the meatiest parts. The one thing that I will say as a bridge, actually, can we go back to that last slide just for a second? I will say as a bridge, because this session was about skills versus pills. Next session is pills versus skills. Medicines and behavioral intervention have to work hand in hand. No physician wants to do this without the support, wants to prescribe medicines without the support of behavioral intervention. And no psychologist wants to ask parents to do really, really hard things if medicines can help them. So the next session is really important. And I will ask our next presenter to start with this slide because I think it'll be a nice bridge if you come back to hear about how medicines can be used in combination with this kind of behavioral treatment.